First of all, welcome. Hello to everyone who's come to the meeting. I'm sure more people will come along as we're going on. Ladder advertised uh, six speakers. Yep. And it's not going to be like a meeting where people are speaking for a long time. It's going to be like a discussion. Okay. And the aim is to look at the possibilities of setting up a grassroots fans campaign against state ownership of football clubs. My name's John. I'm from the Newcastle United Football Club Fans Against Sportswashing. And as many of you who follow us on Twitter know, we've been campaigning since the takeover, for over 18 months. And at first, there was just a few of us. We didn't know each other. And then we got in touch. We started the campaign. Now we've ended up with a lot of coverage. We've got actually a fanzine, a new one's uh, coming out next week. We have a website and growing support. And basically our aim is to call the dictatorship, the regime which owns Newcastle to account. Not let people forget that we are owned by a by a state. Now, why have we sort of called this meeting? Well, we've noticed over the last few months that more and more fans of other clubs have got in touch with us. Uh, and, there's 18 non-state owned clubs in the Premier League. In fact, there's only two clubs which are owned by states. And, we think it's something that shouldn't continue. It's a red line. And we have to look at how we can campaign against this. Now, hopefully, the one remaining speaker who's supposed to be speaking will be able to get a microphone and be able to speak. But we had Mark Jordan later, who's a Leeds fan, who's going to speak about the Football Supporters Association and how we could influence them. We've got Andrew Page from Newcastle United Fans Against Sportswashing, could probably talk a little bit about how we've built our campaign. And also we've got Ed Barker from No Question About That podcast, Manchester United, and also Karen Fletcher from United Against Sportswashing. As I said, very short contributions, more of a conversation. And everybody who's following this, who's listening, is welcome to message me if you want to say something. And we'll put you on to speak as well. But we'll have these people speaking first. The first speaker I'm going to invite to say something is Nick McGeehan, who's a campaigner for workers' rights in the Middle East. And Nick has written quite a lot about the owners of Man City. He got in touch with us a while ago, talking to us about how we'd set up our campaign, because Nick had been involved in, with the owners, talking about the owners of Manchester City. So I'm going to ask Nick to speak first and to give like an overall view about state ownership of football clubs. So Nick, if you're ready.
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me, John? Yeah.
Perfectly. Yes. Good.
Okay. Thanks for organising. Yeah, maybe I guess where I come at it from a different perspective is how I guess I sort of saw it happening, because I used to live in Abu Dhabi and I used to work as a human rights researcher on the United Arab Emirates. On Abu Dhabi, where Manchester City were from. So I sort of watched that happen. And I remember, I can't remember the exact date, but I was working for an American organization, Human Rights Watch. And I remember writing a memo to them saying, we need to pay attention to football club ownership, because it's going to be a big problem for us in the work that we do, because these football clubs, the emotional power that they have can be used for tremendously good purposes, but can also be turned and subverted and used in tremendously damaging ways. And I remember them coming back and saying, we don't really care who owns football clubs. And I remember thinking that was a big mistake. And almost from that point on, I think I started to try and campaign on that. And we ended up doing some work with Amnesty International in Manchester, trying at a very early stage, when people weren't really talking about Abu Dhabi ownership of Manchester City as being a state thing. Everyone assumed that Sheikh Mansour was just some rich guy They wanted to pump loads of money into this club. And we started doing some work up in Manchester, trying to draw attention to the issue, trying to, Manchester's quite a radical city, or certainly wears its radical history on its sleeve. And we tried to harness that a little bit and get people engaged on it. And it was very noticeable how, A, people weren't aware of who was in charge of the club, B, those who were, a lot of them weren't that bothered about these human rights abuses. And C, certainly the political class, the media class in Manchester, from the mainstream dimension, weren't that bothered about what was happening and weren't really lending their voices and speaking out against what was happening. And we've seen that happen again. It's been fascinating and depressing, I have to say, to watch what's been happening in Newcastle. The stuff that John has been campaigning against so effectively. But how it's just followed the same trend. And then again, you see it coming back to Manchester with the Qatar bid for Manchester United and a lot of Manchester United fans wanting this bid to go ahead because they have transformed football. They've transformed the finances of football, and they've transformed the way that you have to be, the way you have to finance a club to be successful at the top level of European football. Again, I don't want to spend my time on here talking about how bad these states are. And I don't want to give the impression that the state is representative of the people who live there. I lived in Abu Dhabi. I made friends in Abu Dhabi. Some of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life are Emirati. So it's important to recognise who's in charge and the type of stuff they do and why they're doing it. They are deeply abusive. They are corrupt, kleptocratic. They are hoarding state resources and using them for their own personal benefit in a way that is deeply detrimental to their societies and to us on a global level. And they are not interested in football. They use football for political purposes. They use it for commercial purposes. They tap into everything that we love about the game, and they subvert it for their own political and commercial ends. So I'm, delighted to be involved in the work that John's doing and trying to gather together fans in opposition to state ownership. The one final thing I'll say is often people say, well, what about, hedge funds owning football clubs? That's awful too. That's dreadful. But they do not, in my view, pose the same existential threat to the club and to games as states do. And I think if we want to reclaim the game, we start with states and we try our best to make sure that they are ejected from the game and that we build a model for the game that actually delivers on the tremendous power of the sport that I think we all love. And that's I think what conversations like this are about. So I'll leave it there. No other speakers.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Kathryn Fletcher from Manchester against Sportswashing. And she got in touch with us because of our campaign, and also, obviously with the Qatari state, which is trying to buy Manchester United. So I'm going to hand over to Kathryn to say something. Okay.
I suppose I'd like to sort of echo really what Nick has just said. I've been a season ticket holder for about 14 years, but I've been a member of Amnesty for a lot longer, and I've been a volunteer activist in the Manchester group. So we have campaigned for many years on human rights in the UAE. But I would also like to say that it is very much about standing with people from these countries. And one of the things that I have done is been in a lot of meetings with human rights groups that are led by people from Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And in fact, one of the chief executives of one of these human rights groups is actually a United fan and is a member of our group and feels very strongly. I think we need to stand by those people who are victims of the state control of their autocratic own leaders. But I've also found it quite demoralising. There's a small group of us who've been trying to campaign against it. We've had virtually no support from the local MPs, from the councillors. I've had many fans from all over Manchester and all around the world contact me to thank us for what we're doing, putting the banners up and making a noise in the media, but it's quite difficult to get any of the fan groups to make any open statement of support, or even to know what the results of their surveys are. So it's hard to know just how many of the fans want the Qataris to owners, or how many are unhappy about that. That's really hard to know. So yes, I feel powerless, really. I mean, the MPs that I just have been at pains to tell us how there is nothing the government can do. There's nothing even the new independent regulators would be able to stop a state bid. And that's really quite depressing. And I feel it very personally, and I'm sure all the other fans will do too. You do feel an association with your club. I mean, it is a sort of love. It's a membership, isn't it, of something. And I know that the Qataris want to buy United because they want to be associated with the glamour of the club, and that means that I am then associated with the state of Qatar, and I don't feel comfortable about that. And I know a lot of fans feel that queasiness. So I don't think I've got anything else to say.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. Well, Kathryn will come back in a moment. But I want to ask Andrew from our campaign, the Newcastle campaign, to speak now. And Kathryn, made a point that it can be demoralising at first, but we were only a few people when we started, and now we've got quite a functioning campaign, and we're reaching out to fans all over the country. I guess at the beginning, one of the conclusions we've had is that basically fans have to be united on this question of state ownership. Now we've got this specific campaign about the Saudi state owning our club, but I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to say a little bit about our campaign. Okay, Andrew.
Hi, John.
Right.
Yeah, well, my name's Andrew Page, and I've been a season ticket holder now for more than 30 years at St James's Park. Started going with my dad when I was 6 years old. And we've just kind of had the 2 tickets in the family ever since, and obviously lived and worked here nearly my whole life as well. And I'm certainly not an activist in the sense that the previous speakers are at all, but I've also always really had the sense that a lot of what I dislike most about this country could probably be summed up by our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And possibly one of the only things that would have made me consider giving up this lifelong routine would have been the state of Saudi Arabia taking over the club. So I was pretty alarmed when that raised its head as a serious possibility back in 2020. And I remember seeing a response from supporters, politicians, media at the time. And I was a bit disheartened to find that it was pretty much a lot of support. It wasn't entirely overwhelming. There was support. It was often with the caveat that we would always stand up for what Newcastle's values were, and we never change what we represent in terms of human rights and our values. Then when the takeover, I mean, every takeover is different. I think Nick earlier said that the Man City one, it just happened quite quickly from what I recall, and it just appeared to be a rich guy just walking into Manchester. Newcastle one wasn't like that. It was a very protracted campaign, went on for 20 months or so, and everybody knows pretty much what Saudi Arabia are. And what was really amazing to me was when the takeover appeared to have been aborted, it looked like it wasn't going to go through. A lot of fans who had previously said some of whom had said they were absolutely helpless to affect this, suddenly launched like an absolutely enormous campaign. I don't know what it was like if you're outside Newcastle, but if you're in Newcastle, it was absolutely all-encompassing and pretty remarkable for a group of people to launch something like that when they previously said they were helpless. And during the course of that campaign, which went on for months, all of the sort of people and institutions where you might expect some opposition or reservations to emerge from pretty much melted away altogether. It was quite amazing to watch. So all the politicians and journalists and supporters groups suddenly were just unreservedly pro-Saudi. So when the takeover finally got passed, I was pretty disheartened about the whole situation. And since then, I've kind of watched Newcastle basically with the full support of everybody, sort of careering in, doing everything they can to follow the Manchester City model. You know, we've recently got the multi-club model. Apparently, that's going to be a good thing for us, where we take over somebody else's football club. That's the latest thing. We wear the Saudi Arabia themed kits. Not many people seem to object to that, and plenty of other examples as well. So I was pretty pleased when I finally saw this campaign emerge. We're not really getting much help from any of the existing structures where you might expect a campaign like this to be launched from. So kind of having to start from scratch. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who in the first place said they would be sympathetic to upholding what we believed in human rights and abuse and the various abuses that Saudi Arabia commits, showing that we don't endorse that in any way. And we are starting to get more and more support. And I think one of the main things we did when the campaign really got some traction was when we started working with the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. And they put it to us that they would like us to highlight the plight of 8 minors who were facing the death penalty in Saudi Arabia. And they wanted us to do that by holding a protest at the ground. And we'd sort of floated the idea of protesting at the ground ourselves. So we were more than happy to do this. And we did that, and it was pretty successful. Got a lot of media attention, let a lot of people know that we were there. Also, as John said, we put out a few fanzines. And one of the other things we did, which caught publicity, was we delivered a letter to Eddie Howe on behalf of a man who was whose brother was facing the death penalty in Saudi Arabia. And again, that was at the instigation of the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. That was their idea. And since then, campaigns continue to grow. Do get a lot of attention not so much from local media. Can kind of see why that might be. Now they're fully on board with the Saudi-led takeover. But good to see that the campaign is continuing to grow, and does look like, especially by reaching out to other clubs and supporters of other clubs, that we might be able to build something that really stand up and oppose the direction the game's going at the moment. So I think that's pretty much everything I've got to say in terms of what we represent and what my involvement's been. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Well, I'm going to ask Ed Barker from No Question About That podcast, it's a Manchester United podcast, to speak. And after that, I'm going to sort of make a couple of points about where do we go from here, and is it possible to get a campaign going, united campaign of fans against state ownership. And the first thing, we have to sort of be clear on is, why we are against state ownership and why it's bad for the future of the game and it's for the future of football, and why why fans should actually be united on this question. So I'm going to ask Ed to speak now on, why he thinks this is important.
Thanks, John. Yeah, appreciate this and the opportunity to meet you all and speak about this topic. So no question about that. It started as a blog in 2002, I think, long time back, and we started the podcast in 2009. It's predominantly a podcast these days, and we've always taken a keen eye on the political economy of football and the role that first the commercialization of football had in changing what our game was. So if you remember back when United IPO'd, there was a lot of protests against that. There was protests against the Murdoch takeover. I was involved with that. And then against the Glazer takeover that eventually happened in 2005. And then I think that's very naturally, for me at least, kind of bled into thinking about what state ownership means. And so we've been talking about state ownership essentially since the podcast started. And I think although at first the Manchester City takeover felt like another kind of economic issue, all the money pouring in, very quickly, for me at least, became clear that this was more than that. And state actors in our game went from being a sort of distorting factor to now, I think, a cancer on our game. And so that I take a very keen interest in that. And I think about I think about this issue holistically, and that's why I got in touch with John, because it's not just about Manchester United or Manchester City or Paris Saint-Germain or Newcastle. It's about the game as a whole that I think all of us on this call love and is a big part of our lives, been a big part of my life for more than 40 years. And so I want to use what platform I have in having built an audience over nearly 20 years now, to raise these issues and to say that state ownership and the nefarious goals that these states have in owning football clubs is not good for our game, and it's not good for the people who are suffering in some of the countries that are buying football clubs, and it's not good for fans, even though on the surface it seems like it is. And one of the reasons, I took a pause when it looked like Qatar may be in pole position to take over United, and thought, well, what does that mean for me personally as a fan? Should I still be a fan if this happens? And that's a very hard question to ask. Or should I use this platform to help try and push back or educate or raise some of the issues that Nick and Karen and John and Mark and others have brought up on this call? And I think that's where I'm at. And we can, and I know, John, you want to talk about the impact of state ownership, and we'll do that in a bit. But it's very much at the forefront of my mind now. I'm in a bubble because our podcast, as I said, has always looked at the political economy of sport and talked about politics. And so I find that people who get in touch with me over email, I put out an email every week to about 5,000 United fans. I find that they are quite united against a state takeover, but that is my personal bubble. I think if you follow the argument on Twitter, it looks very different, doesn't it? And it looks like the people who have pushed back against state ownership in Manchester City all these years are now very much in favour of it and believe that's the only way that clubs can compete. And that, I'm afraid, is a zero-sum game, isn't it? Because if we believe that the only way our clubs can compete is by being owned by a state and having state wealth, then everyone needs to be owned by a state. And I think, John, that's probably one of the areas you want to go to as well. Certainly what I covered in my conversation with Nicholas a few months ago. But I'll stop there. For me, it's a very important issue. And even if we start with a small base of people on this call talking about this issue, it can grow from there. And I know John is very bullish in believing that a grassroots campaign can have an impact. And I really hope he's right. So thanks, John. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Well, it's that was food for thought, what you're saying. So now I'm going to open it up. I can see because I'm hosting this. I can see we've got fans from Spurs, Arsenal. I'm not sure what the other clubs are. So if you want to say where you're from, if you want to speak, just indicate to me you want to speak.
It's worth saying, particularly in light of what Kathryn said about it feeling hopeless, and certainly about the level of support that you have within fan bases, and not the type of fan bases that Ed's talking about, the contacting him, but the general fan bases. It's worth pointing out that we will be proven correct at some point, that these states will, because of their motives and because of the way that they operate, that they will cause tremendous damage to the game. And that at some point in the near future or the medium-term future, that we will be proven correct in our assessment of the threat that they pose to the game. So as much as it feels as if you're sort of pushing against this tremendously powerful forces who cannot effectively be opposed, ultimately there will be a moment where we're able to turn around and say, we told you so. We explained that this was going to happen to you. And I think the fact that the benefit of having people getting organised at this stage, getting together at this stage, is that when that happens, you've already made your arguments. You've already outlined your position. You've already explained what the problems are. and you will be proven correct, I think, in that. And it may take a bit of time, and your clubs might win a lot of trophies in that time. Newcastle United fans might feel, 5 years down the line that, that, I don't know, a couple of premierships and Champions League might all have been worth it. But there are a lot of fans, and I think people who care about the welfare of the game more generally, and are not focused just on their clubs, will recognise that. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay, Nick, thanks. Can you hear me now?
If John, you're back on and you want to redirect us.
Okay, all right. Okay, so thanks for that, Nick. I'm sure you can't hear me. Well, what I was saying was that the situation that we're at now. Okay, there's a football review going on in Parliament, and they've published the it's slightly tightened up owners and directors test. So what are we going to do now? We said we're going to finish in an hour, so we've got like a half an hour left, and I'm opening it up to everyone else. But one of the things that we think we should be doing is pressurizing in the campaign to get the owners and directors test tightened up. That states-owned football clubs is bad for the game. It's bad for the future of the game, and it could destroy football as we know it. And that really, it's an argument that we think we can win, and we're very confident about this. That states, very simply, should not be allowed to own football clubs, and especially human rights abusing regimes. How do we do that? Well, starting off by what we're doing tonight. Also, one of the people who was down to speak is Mark Jordan, who's a Leeds fan, has been active in the Football Supporters Association, and also in Leeds fan groups as well. One of the points that he always makes is that the FSA really hasn't got a strong position on the question of fan ownership, and I think that's something we could talk about tonight, because the Football Supporters Association is supposed to represent fans, but I don't know really if they've had a debate or they've got a clear position. Perhaps someone knows about this, but I think it's another angle for our campaign that we should be, pressurizing the FSA to take a clear position. A while back, we appeared on Radio 5 in the morning, and there was the ex-minister Tracy Crouch, and we asked her to her face, via the radio, would you support a tightening up of the owners and directors test? And she said no. So basically, when you ask them, the ones in power, they're not in favour of tightening up. Now, we've got on our website, if you want to go to the website, we've got like a petition section where we've got a model letter for fans in Newcastle to write to their MPs about human rights and about the series. We've also got a more general one for fans to start writing to their of any club, to start writing to their local MPs and say, what are you going to vote for? On this question. Now, these are things that we can do, and I agree with Ed that it says 5,000 Man United fans who are against state ownership. That's fantastic, and we can build on that. Now, I'm sure we could build on that in other clubs as well. So let's open it up. Does anyone else want to say anything? Even somebody who's already spoken, or anyone, just indicate if you want to speak. Okay. Can you just introduce yourself?
Am I speaking? Can everyone hear me right now?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Yeah, just introduce yourself.
Amazing. Well, hi everyone. Hi, this is Jack, one of the co-hosts of From the Backseat Football Podcast. Firstly, I really enjoy listening to this. I feel like I'm less knowledgeable than everyone else on these topics, so I'm not going to cover things that have already been said, because I've just really enjoyed listening to it and seeing how engaged everyone is in these topics and the activism that goes on. So, firstly, thank you for kind of sharing that and also doing something about it, right? It's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to actually do it. I'd say, aside from the sort of human rights elements of it, which are, abhorrent and just, inexcusable, really, I think one of the things that's always bugged me about state-owned clubs and the process of selling an asset to, a country basically, is that for me, I've always thought, if we take the example of Newcastle is a football club with a rich heritage. It's deep in the community. It's a football club that exists as the only one in the city. And so it's borderline, religious. It's like such a fundamental part of being from Newcastle is what I see from the outside, right? I think that's so important. And so to then take that fundamentally like the soul, I guess, of Newcastle, and then sell it to Saudi Arabia feels just really deeply immoral to me, because as an outsider, I'm watching it, I'm thinking that asset will never come back now. Although it still sits in Newcastle, like whatever happens with it, you've lost control of it. And if they want to take it a different direction, if we want to play a 30-night game in Saudi Arabia, you're kind of at the mercy of that. And I think that is like another element that really doesn't sit well with me, is that you lose something really precious and unique that's like fundamental to a community and to the country. And if all 20 pubs become state-owned in the future, like, are we ever going to get them back realistically without government intervention? And that's such a horrifying thing, that process is already underway. We might lose such fundamental community assets permanently. It would never work in the reverse, right? The UK is not buying bits of, other countries' architecture or whatever in the same way. And that, it doesn't sit well with me. But that's just another thing that I've kind of been thinking about as well, on top of the more obvious points, right?
Okay. I've got a question here. Question for Nick. Okay. Do you want to ask the question, JP? Do you want to ask the question? Or shall I just read it out? Okay, Nick, I want to read a question. Okay. The question is, can you expand on how states seek to use the prestige and enthusiasm for political means? We know people say that sportswashing doesn't really work because it actually draws more attention to human rights abuses. But like, for example, the World Cup in Qatar. But how are these states, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, how are they using sportswashing? How does it actually manifest itself?
Nick, the question was about, beyond sports washing, because we've seen actually the impact of obviously the World Cup and clubs being owned, like shining a light on some of the human rights abuses. How is the takeover of these clubs actually being used? And I think this is like hinting at the kind of political and soft power dimensions and co-opting institutions. And maybe you want to speak on that a little bit beyond just the reputational aspects.
Sure. And apologies, John, for apparently speaking over you. I thought there was some technical issue, which is clearly mine. I think a relatively short answer is that sports washing is quite a reductive term, right? The idea that you buy a club and it absolves you of all your sins and nobody knows about all the bad stuff you've done, that's obviously false, right? That's not what it's about. There is a reputational dimension, but it is not that you are suddenly, as I say, cleansed of all your sins. It is that you have a far more powerful competing narrative that will drown the bad news and good news. You generate far more positive column inches talking about all the great things you've done in your association with these very powerful brands, these clubs, and they have become brands. And that's going to take precedence over the fact that you're torturing people or rendering people or forced disappearances of people or all the other terrible stuff that these states do. But there's more to it than that as well. It enables you to build political connections in centres of influence. And Manchester certainly is a centre of influence, has been for some time, the whole Northern powerhouse stuff, and it being almost Britain's second city under the leadership of Lisa Bernstein. The Emiratis were delighted to jump into that, and they were aided in that cause by the British government and by Tony Blair. And similarly, you see how Boris Johnson and the British government were incredibly keen to get the Saudi bid into Newcastle, as detailed in great detail by Adam Crafton in his piece not long ago in The Athletic. So it is about reputation, and that's part, but it's also about commerce, also about money, and at the end of the day, it's like anything done by a state. It's about power and establishing power bases. So I think that, we're going to see some very interesting books written by some very smart people in years to come who are going to outline that in a lot more detail than I can and with a lot more clarity. But yeah, it's about more than reputation, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Nick, even though you can't hear me. Okay. So anyone else want to make comments? Someone who hasn't spoken, you might want to ask a question, or how can we take this forward? We've got quite good attendance, quite a few different clubs. What can we do? Now we've come the end of the season, we've got time to think about what we can do. What sort of ideas and initiatives could we take? Does anyone want to come in on that?
Hey, John. It's just Ed. One aspect that's sort of been touched on, the kind of media aspects of it, and I'm interested in how so many of the national media are kind of refusing to engage with what has actually happened here. Some have. Adam Crafton was mentioned, who's one of very few, I think, who's engaged with this topic. But particularly the athletics model of having fan-centric journalists seem to have been co-opted by this model. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on how the narrative can be framed in a different way, so that some of the things that you and Nick have talked about can be get into the media more strongly than it has done. It isn't drowned out by the football. And I don't know whether you've had any success at that in your campaign so far.
Well, I can tell a bit of the story of our campaign, because there was only a few when we started, and we did stuff on Twitter and Facebook. But the turning point was when we, as Andrew said, when we spoke to the Saudi Human Rights Group, and basically they gave us the courage actually to go and stand outside the ground, because we felt quite angry that it was just being ignored about how they're using the club to divert attention away from terrible human rights abuses. And when we did that, and also the anniversary of the takeover, we did get some interviews in the Evening Chronicle. Now, we've got an article coming out in the new fanzine where we go into it in a little bit more detail. We mentioned this in the statement I did when Newcastle qualified for the Champions League. One of the things we made is that basically the local press has been abysmal. It's been almost like a giant megaphone for the regime. Andrew often mentions when he writes stuff that regime figures turn up at St. James's Park. In fact, Mohammed bin Salman's brother, who's the money man behind from the world money man, but the one who organizes the finances of the regime, was sitting in a box at the cup final against Manchester United with a Newcastle scarf on, and they didn't even mention. They mentioned the name, but they don't go into who these people are. We've been pretty hard with them and said, some of these people have they're committing crimes against the Saudi people. We've had a few articles in the local press, but it's true. Actually, press in Europe, Germany, Holland, France, Finland, they've been a lot more interested in that, and also the national press. What's happened in Newcastle? We would explain a little bit how we've got to this situation. Is because I would say the people who should have known better, and by that I mean fanzine editors, fan groups leaders, Labour politicians, and even Alan Shearer and ex-players, people who should know better, haven't done their job. And most of all, the press, has not done the job, and they've created this narrative that everyone's against Newcastle. Miguel Delaney is actually criticized every time he writes an article doing his job. He's criticised it in the Northeast as if he's got an agenda against Newcastle. It's not that. What a lot of fans are avoiding, I think, in Newcastle is that it's not against Newcastle. Fans are thinking about the future of the game. This is where we come in, the future of football. Because if we allow another club to be owned by Qatar, example, or I remember being outside in St. James's Park, was asking, I said, is it okay for the Saudi state to own Newcastle? And he goes, well, okay, it's happened. I said, what about North Korea? What about Iran? What about the United States? Where would it end? So we've managed to get our voice heard. It's hard work, but we've managed to do it. Any more questions? Anyone else want to tell you? Who's that?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
There's a guy.
Sorry.
Okay, are you connected?
I think. Oh, can you hear me? Or
Yes.
no?
Yes. Go on. Yeah. Who's that?
So the one question that I did have was, I agree with everything you said. Like, just to be clear, and fundamentally, I think you're entirely right that this is a very slippery slope. But I think one of the fundamental issues is that football clubs are so valuable right now that the list of people who can actually buy them is a grim list, right? Billionaires or states in general. That's just it's a very small group of people that can actually buy a football club. And how many of those people do you align your ethics with? Potentially none of them. And so I think potentially it's not just about, changing the rules. It's actually implementing a system where the valuations can't get this high. And I think one potential idea or solution would be similar to what they do in the Bundesliga, where each club is, fan owned, I think 51% or close enough to 51%. And that keeps things, I guess, more stable potentially. And that might be something that we could all look at in the future, maybe as an idea to take forward. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay. Is there anyone who wants to come back on that briefly?
Yeah, I can speak about that. Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. Sorry, I missed what club you're from, but and your name. There's been a long-held campaign against the Glazer ownership at United. I've been involved with that. As you know, some people broke away and formed FC United of Manchester. I'm also a shareholder in that club in 2005 as a rejection of this kind of loss of control and the fact that football's so valuable that only hedge funds, billionaires, and autocratic states appear to be able to own clubs these days. The challenge, of course, is the path from where we're at today. And in United's case, we're probably a lost cause there. The opportunity for fan ownership of any meaningful size seems to have been gone. In fact, the Manchester United Supporters Trust was negotiating with the club to get some kind of equity. It would have been a small amount, but some kind of equity post the Super League failure. Even that has kind of stalled. Not their fault, by the way, at all. And so it feels quite bleak in terms of fan ownership. I mean, if we want to look to Germany that you mentioned, there is some hope there. The club's rejected an opportunity for private equity, about 2 billion euros worth of private equity funding this week. Very narrowly rejected it, but rejected it. And all of that was because of fan pushback. There's very strong fan culture in Germany, in the Bundesliga 2, and that was a serious factor in that private equity money being rejected. Unfortunately, the sort of laissez-faire market approach in England means that isn't rejected very often. And as a United fan, we're left with, what options here? A state in Qatar, a former private equity guy in Jim Ratcliffe, now turned one of the world's largest polluters, or vulture capitalists in Elliott Management and others of a similar ilk. And it's a rogues gallery of potential owners. And so from that point of view, it feels really depressing. But we can look around England and say it's not just about the big clubs. There are fan-owned clubs that are doing okay around England, and that is, a golden ticket, a bulkhead against nefarious states and private equity ownership. So, great sentiment. It just seems really hard at Premier League level.
Thanks for that.
Can I add something to that? No, I'm not speaking over
quickly,
John.
Yes.
Again, this is Nick.
Yes.
The great thing about fan ownership, the good thing about certain campaigns is at least you know what mountain you're at the bottom of. Like if you have a very clear aim, irrespective of how difficult it is, you can mobilize and you can generate support for that. And there will be a flashpoint with state ownership. Something will go badly wrong, and one club or a broader structure will be deeply damaged by this. And the key thing is to have your arguments in place before that happens. So when the political winds shift, that you're in a place to say, we told you so, this is what we're pushing for. So I personally think, and I don't know who the speaker was earlier, but I agree with you. I think fan ownership is the model. And the point is to, yes, aim high and wait for the moment when this awful model collapses in on itself. And then you've got the arguments, and hopefully you have some political support to push for this model that will actually deliver what we want.
Okay. I'm going to add something to that. There was someone called Jonathan who wanted to speak, but they seem to have disappeared. I think that football fans are fed this narrative that there's no alternative to dodgy billionaires and states. I'll keep repeating it. There's only 2 clubs which are owned by states in the Premier League, one in Paris Saint-Germain. Now, in La Liga in Spain, this year the league was won by Barcelona. The cup final, the King's Cup final, was between Osasuna, or a Basque team, and Real Madrid. Real Madrid won, unfortunately. What have those 3 clubs got in common? Well, those 3 clubs are owned, in theory, by the fans. You have elections for the board and for the president. No, they're not perfect, but along with Athletic Bilbao, Newcastle played many years ago, they're actually owned by what they say in Spanish, the socios, or the members. Now, this idea that there's no alternative to what we've got in the Premier League, or the direction the Premier League's going in, it's just not true. There's the German model. There's also this fan-owned clubs in Britain. But the idea that a fan-owned club couldn't generate money is unsaid by Real Madrid and Barcelona. I know we could go into another time, but they've got money. And one of the reasons that, I read somewhere that the Saudis didn't want, couldn't buy Barcelona or Real Madrid is because obviously Mohammed bin Salman's not very keen on elections. He likes to have his people, appointed by him in charge. So there are alternatives. This idea that it's just a monolith and that, it's going to be state-owned clubs from now on is not true. Jonathan, do you want to speak?
Hi, you hear me?
Yes. Can you just say which club you're from? And
I'm a United fan. Manchester United, I should say. I lived in Newcastle for 10 years, and so I have a bit of sympathy for them. I know Ed doesn't. And it does feel personal on that level. And I just wanted to say great work to everyone involved. I think you're fighting the good fight. I did want to sort of ask about the proposed rule to prevent state ownership. I think Newcastle haven't done a very good job. Haven't tried very hard to hide the links between the Saudi government, the PIF, and the ownership of Newcastle United. But say you were successful in getting that rule passed. What's to stop a particularly savvy sovereign wealth fund group from setting up an SPV and covertly control a football club? And it feels like there would be ways around that. And a second question, it's more directed at the Newcastle United guys. What do you say about the allegation? I suppose the assumption in some quarters that Newcastle were particularly primed for a country like Saudi to take over because you had a large fan base, you hadn't had success in a long time, had a particularly terrible owner, and we're looking in part of the country that has often felt sort of overlooked. Do you think that there's any sort of truth to that? Do you think this kind of approach would have been easier to rebuff for, say, Midlands club or a London club?
Okay. I don't know, Andrew, do you want to come back on that, or anyone else?
Yeah, I think possibly there is some truth to that. One thing I've noticed looking at the proposed Qatari takeover of Manchester United is it does seem to be a little bit more pushback from there than there was whenever the takeover of Newcastle was proposed. And I would guess maybe that might be because Manchester United managed to, even with the Glazers in charge, has managed to enjoy some success. They might think it's possible to achieve, for supporters might think it's possible to achieve some level of success without state backing. Whereas, I mean, we've seen some fanzine editors saying very, very fatalistic viewpoint is that you have to have this model if you're going to succeed. And they have pointed as well to the so-called investment in the region, which is being presented as being possibly very beneficial for us. Although I would say that it's highly debatable whether that would actually be the case. But yeah, I think I would agree with what you've said there, that possibly we were selected possibly because of the recent history of the club with the terrible ownership, the perceived underachievement and so forth. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Did you want to say something?
Like, can I say one thing? It's just, sorry, I don't want to monopolize this. Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I was kind of optimistic earlier in saying, look, in my bubble, the people I communicate with, there's a kind of understanding of what state ownership means. And, often fans use this kind of moniker of we want our club back, but it's not your club when it's owned by a state as a tool of foreign policy. And that's a message I've tried to communicate in the most friendly way with people, and to build some notion of pushback. That said, not a single Manchester United group, supporters trust, the supporters, any of the supporters groups, any of the fanzine, except for Scott at the Republic of Mancunia, the 1958, which is a very successful protest group, none of them have come out and said we are against state ownership. Even the groups supporting groups representing LGBT fans have not done that either. And so it's starting from a low base, I'd say, of people who are willing to take on some of these issues, and very few people, like how we've seen at Newcastle, despite United's sort of success in recent years. Very few people are prepared to say, "Hey, we don't want that state money," and so it is a difficult road, I'd say, to go, from here to there to educate the fans.
Could I just add something there, John? I can hear you again now, by the way. There is really interesting context. I think that's a really brilliant question. Bear in mind, like the impact of deindustrialization on the north of England, and the impact that had on Manchester and Newcastle, coupled by the effect of austerity. I had a chat with a sort of Newcastle commentator, stroke fan, and his line was Newcastle was easy to buy, and I think that applied to Manchester as well. So there is a big political context to this, which is that the impact of globalization and global capitalism and deindustrialization did make these clubs easier to buy, I think, perhaps than other ones. And I don't think it's coincidence that it was clubs in the north who were targeted, for not just for the reasons that the fan bases were desperate for success, but because of the way that the local economies had been gutted, and sort of traditional working class solidarity, the trade union movement, etc., has been decimated. I think that is a factor here, and it is worth pointing to that, while not shying away from pointing to the lack of civil leadership here. I do think that's important.
Okay, now we've been going for about an hour, and we said we're going to do an hour. So I'm going to make a couple of comments about where we can go from here and where we're at. But also, if anyone's got anything they desperately want to say, or any of the speakers want to come back, we can finish in about 5 or 10 minutes. But and I'll say something at the end about what we do, some suggestions of what we do next. But listening to the last questions and comments, it can seem that we're up against it. It seems it's hard, and a lot of the fans who have been hostile towards this say, well, this is the way it is. just got to accept it, enjoy the ride. But, everyone has a red line. The red line for us in our campaign is that, we don't want a dictatorship owning our club. And it's really, can, affect the reputation of Tyneside. But this question of states own clubs, we're just at the beginning of the process. I keep repeating, it's only 2 clubs who are owned by states. And it's a bit like what you call the salami tactic, They keep taking a bit off, and then at the end you end up with no salami, And if we don't, unite across all different clubs against state ownership, then we can say goodbye to the football the way, we know and love it. Somebody commented to me, I think it was maybe one of the speakers sent to me a while ago. I think it was 2017, that Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, the owners of Man City and Newcastle, were seriously considering, invasion of Qatar. I think it was in 2017. Yeah. Now you imagine if Qatar owned Manchester United. Imagine the political upheaval it would cause, in the Premier League. If you had, 3 owners fighting each other in a war. And the point is, it's very unstable, the Middle East. All these cases that we're highlighting, we just highlighted a young woman yesterday who's been imprisoned, detained, and she hasn't been given a sentence yet, for tweeting in favor of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. So the people ask, what's sports washing? Okay. Sports washing is when they have Amanda Stabley, a woman, out front as Newcastle, as a spokesperson for Newcastle. They have a women's team, the LGBT plus group that gets photo opportunities. For sports washing is when they do that in Newcastle, but then they jail in young women for 30, 45 years in Saudi Arabia. There's been no reform, and it's the tail wagging the dog, as far as that goes. And the point for us is that this could, if we don't do something now, we don't unite across different, all the different clubs, who's going to make a bid next? What state? If they establish the idea that states can own clubs, then there'll be no end to it. Now, what I'm going to do is just make one last appeal for anyone who wants to say something, or if any of the speakers want to sum up in a couple of minutes about their ideas about where we go from now, from this meeting. Okay, so anyone want to say something?
Can I just make one point, actually, because I think we mustn't lose sight.
Kathryn, okay.
I think we mustn't lose sight that although the human rights aspects are obviously really very important, there's also the factor of the distortion of the money that there is on the rest of the football pyramid, because these states are able to pump money in, and if the allegations at Manchester City have got any truth in them, they're also able to hide them. And that puts pressure on all the other clubs to overspend. And I mean, that's why the government has brought about this independent regulator, isn't it? Because of clubs like Bury collapsing. And so these states owning will have an impact on every other club. It will make them more unstable, more likely to become insolvent and close, and right down the pyramid. So, I think there are some very good reasons why we should be reaching out to clubs in the Championship, League One, League Two as well, because I think it could affect them very much. Perhaps that's an argument we can use as well, that it's destabilising for the security of the whole football pyramid.
Okay. Anyone else?
What has the reaction of the European Union been to date? I mean, they have got quite heavily involved in the regulation of football in the past, especially on the financial side of things. And I'm interested. I know the UK is not in the European Union anymore, but it obviously the EU has a serious impact on the European football market as a whole. Have they commented on state ownership at all?
No, I can take that one. Ed, no, they haven't, and they could, irrespective of the fact that the UK is not in the European Union anymore. European clubs, English clubs play in European competition. The European Union could take an active regulatory role in sport if it chose to do so. It has the competencies to do so in the same way that it has taken competencies, for example, on tech. So Twitter and Facebook, which are based outside the European Union, have to conform to European Union rules if they want to they want to trade in Europe. So the European Union is a really interesting actor here. And if the European Union could be convinced that it was in their political interests to actively regulate sport, now what it does now is it reactively responds to things such as the Bosman case, for example. Yeah, the European Union is fascinating here, and that's probably an entire other Twitter space discussion. But it is a fascinating actor for sure. If pressure could be brought to bear there.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Any other points, contributions?
Yeah. I think earlier, there was some discussion about what could fans do more immediately rather than long-term aims. And I think in our experience, in my opinion, the most impactful thing we did by far is when we did the protest at the ground. We've done a lot of other worthwhile things, but that generated the most attention and the biggest media impact. And I do kind of wonder into what would happen if fans were able to generate just any sort of dissent towards the ownership from within the stadium on a regular basis. I mean, states like Saudi Arabia just do not like dissent at all. They just, you look at the sentences they hand out just for tweeting. How would they react if we were able to build just some sort of hostility towards the ownership from supporters in the ground on a regular basis? Would they feel that they were able to achieve their aims? If supporters were reacting to them like that, I mean, it's very difficult to sort of engender that sort of reaction while the team's winning. But if we're able to do that, how would they respond? It would be absolutely fascinating to test them out and see how they reacted to that. It's sort of something that I think we could aim for in the short to medium term.
Definitely. Anyone else? Yeah, I just wanted to say to everyone who's taking part in this that one of the people listening, I'm not going to say the name, but is the sister of one of the most courageous human rights activists in Saudi Arabia. And the idea that what we're doing tonight, and that, that the discussion that we're having is not important, is not true, because, as I said, we've got Abu Dhabi, terrible human rights record, Saudi Arabia, one of the bloodiest regimes in the world, owning two of our clubs. And, we can't let that pass. We have to actually protest against it. Our experience in Newcastle is that when we have the opportunity to meet and talk to Newcastle fans, when we do that, I find it quite easy to convince them that Saudi Arabia, should be condemned for what they're doing. But the problem is that for the reasons I mentioned before, the media is sort of created, along with the other people involved with this, but they've created an atmosphere where they're not going to talk about it. In our talks with Saudi activists, they said, and I agree totally with Andrew said. He said, if we manage to convince, and I think we'll get there eventually, if we manage to convince some figures, some political figures, some ex-players to say something, it'll have a massive effect. At the moment, there's a bit of an unspoken pact, between the fan base and the people around the club not to say anything. But unfortunately, and this is the situation, things are not getting better in Saudi Arabia. They're getting worse, and they're jailing, women for speaking out in favor of women's rights. The message I think we've got to all fans is, what state could buy your club if this is allowed to pass, So I just want to make some sort of very, very briefly final comments about where we go from here. And there would be an opportunity if anyone else wants to come back and add, especially the speakers, who are involved in this, if they've got any other ideas. But what I would suggest is, this is what I'd suggest, that everybody who's participated today in the meeting, send us a direct message, DM, say you're interested in getting involved in the campaign. You can send us an email. Obviously follow us as well. The new edition of our fanzine is called Hailstones in the Desert. And the reason why it's called that always, I think it's an important point, is when we started this campaign, we were called snowflakes, but actually, you say, oh, woke snowflakes for believing in human rights. And, basically what we said to the people who said that to us was that, to be a human rights activist in Saudi Arabia, you're not a snowflake. You're the hardest of the hardest, that to stand up and in favor of humans and women's rights, you have to be very, very strong. So it's dedicated to the Saudi human rights activists. So have a look. I think that the day of the cup final, we're going to put out the new fanzine. The fanzine sort of this month is dedicated more to the to the victims. Instead of listening to the regime, listen to the victims. So there's a lot of articles from other fans of other clubs, and it talks about this campaign, about what we can do. Have a look at our website. I've mentioned in the section called petitions, and in the petitions part, we mentioned there's a model letter to MPs. There's a lot more things we can do, but one of the things we think we should do is like a two-pronged attack. It's like, even just the people on here, if you write to your local MP, ask them what they're going to say, what they're going to vote in the football review, the owners and directors test. Ask them, but also I think as well, start to put pressure on the Football Supporters Association. We haven't talked too much about. Fortunately, Mark couldn't get a microphone to be able to speak, but next time I suppose we can do that. But basically, let's get a list of people who are interested and have a united campaign. I'm sure there's a lot of things, more things we can do on this. So I'll just make a final call if anyone else wants to say anything. Perhaps the speakers want to sum up on something. If not, we can say this has been like the start of something big. Anyone else? Finally, okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Okay, and follow the points that I said at the end. Keep in touch, and let's campaign against state ownerships and dodgy billionaires owning our football clubs. Okay, take care. I don't know if we've got any Manchester City fans on here, but good luck to whatever team in the FA Cup final, and let's hope football wins. Okay, all right. Bye bye.